On the day of his lavish wedding, billionaire Brandon King thought he had everything: wealth, success, and the perfect bride. But when disaster struck, it was a young, barefoot boy, unknown to anyone, who risked everything to save his bride from a deadly fall. As the crowd held its breath, the boy's simple request would change their lives forever and reveal a secret that no one could have ever imagined. If you are new here, then please subscribe this channel and show thumbs up by liking the video. Now let's move to this wonderful story. Brandon King stood at the altar, his eyes fixed on the beautiful scene unfolding before him. The grand bridge, decorated with white roses, stretched across the city's skyline, looking almost magical against the soft glow of the afternoon sky. The entire space was filled with the soft melodies of a string quartet, creating a romantic atmosphere that seemed to echo with elegance. Guests in their finest suits and dresses murmured excitedly as the time to meet the bride finally arrived. At 38, Brandon had built an empire. He was a millionaire, known for his success in real estate, tech investments, and luxury imports. His wealth had opened doors to unimaginable opportunities, yet none of that compared to the joy he felt at this moment. None of his accomplishments had prepared him for the feeling of standing on the edge of forever, knowing he was about to marry the love of his life. The woman he was about to marry wasn't a model, an actress, or even a socialite. She was Isabel Ross, a humble school teacher from the Bronx. Her laughter was soft and genuine, and her heart was one of gold. They'd met 3 years ago at a charity event that he had only attended because his assistant had begged him to. But when he saw her there, surrounded by children, giving them books and painting their faces with such care, something inside him shifted. There was no sign of recognition in her eyes when she saw him. She didn't care about his wealth, his fame, or his business empire. She simply cared about the children they were helping. That moment had changed everything for Brandon. He kept coming back to that event, seeing her more often, and each time, they became closer. Their love grew slowly, quietly, but it was real, deeply real. And now, standing in the middle of this extravagant wedding, surrounded by everything he had ever dreamed of, it was her that mattered most. As the music played, softly in the background, Isabel, dressed in a beautiful white gown, stood just a few feet away from Brandon, adjusting her veil nervously. She smiled at her maid of honor, Amara, who whispered in her ear. "He's been looking at his watch every 2 minutes." Amara teased, trying to lighten the mood. Isabel laughed softly. "That's not nerves," she said. "He's probably thinking about spreadsheets." Amara chuckled. Across the bridge, Brandon kept glancing at Isabel, his thoughts drifting. His best friend from childhood, Ralph, nudged him with a teasing grin. "You're really sure about this?" Ralph joked. "You're marrying a school teacher, man, no prenup?" Brandon's expression turned serious. He didn't even hesitate. "She saved me," he said, "from myself. She's the smartest decision I've ever made." Ralph just nodded, sensing the depth of his friend's love for Isabel. The guests were still mingling, their laughter echoing through the air, but Brandon's attention never wavered. He only had eyes for one person, and that person was slowly walking toward him across the platform bridge. Isabel began her walk down the aisle, her bouquet in hand, her train floating behind her like mist. She was the picture of grace and beauty, and as she moved closer, Brandon's heart swelled with love. He could barely contain his emotions, but he stood there, composed, awaiting his bride. But just as the ceremony seemed to be unfolding perfectly, something unexpected happened. As Isabel walked toward the altar, her heel caught on the edge of the stone barrier of the bridge. Her body jerked forward with a sudden force, and in the blink of an eye, she was falling. Gasps filled the air. People screamed. Time seemed to slow down. Isabel flailed, trying desperately to catch herself, but she was seconds from tumbling over the edge of the bridge, towards the dark river below. The guests froze in shock, unable to react. The violinist dropped his instrument in disbelief. The best man lunged forward, but it was too late. Then, something miraculous happened. A small figure darted through the crowd, moving faster than anyone could have anticipated. It was a young boy, no older than 7. His clothes were torn, his feet were bare, and yet, with a burst of instinctive bravery, he rushed forward without hesitation. His hand reached out just in time to grab Isabel's wrist. He pulled with all the tiny strength he had, his body trembling, but somehow he kept her from falling. The crowd stood in stunned silence, unable to believe what had just happened. Isabel, now steady on her feet, looked down at the boy still holding her wrist. Her heart raced, but as the shock wore off, she realized the boy had just saved her life. Tears filled her eyes as she gently removed her hand from his grasp and looked at him. Brandon, too, rushed forward, his breath shaky with relief, and hugged Isabel tightly. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Did he hurt you?" Isabel shook her head slowly. "No. He saved me." Brandon knelt down, his gaze soft as he looked at the boy. He was covered in dust, his clothes barely holding together, and a thin red string was tied around his wrist. His wide eyes looked up at Brandon with uncertainty. "Who are you?" Brandon asked gently. "Where did you come from?" But the boy remained silent, his expression unreadable. The guests began murmuring, confused and curious about the young boy, who had appeared out of nowhere. Someone tried to offer the boy a bottle of water. Another pulled out $100 bill, but the boy didn't move. He only looked at Isabel, his eyes meeting hers as he smiled. Security guards stepped forward, but Isabel quickly intervened. "Don't touch him. He's with me," she said firmly. The crowd stood still, unsure of what to do. Brandon placed a hand on the boy's shoulder again, his voice warm. "You saved her life, son. I don't know who you are, but thank you." Isabel knelt beside the boy, her voice kind. "We owe you more than we can say. What's your name? Where are your parents? What can we do for you?" The boy, still catching his breath, looked around at the elegant crowd, his face serious. And then, he said something that would change everything. "Can I tell you what I want?" The silence on the bridge was palpable, and everyone waited in suspense as the boy looked up at Isabel, his dark eyes filled with something much deeper than his age could explain. The bridge was silent, the guests frozen in place, and all eyes were on the young boy who had just saved Isabel's life. The air was thick with disbelief. The violinist, who had earlier played the beautiful music that filled the scene, stood still, his instrument now forgotten. The best man, who had rushed to help, but was too late, stood with his mouth agape, unable to process what had just happened. And then there was Brandon, still kneeling beside Isabel, his hands trembling as he held her, his eyes now focused on the boy who had intervened so selflessly. The boy, no older than 7, had a small frame, his arms and legs thin, his clothes tattered. His bare feet were covered in dirt from running so fast, yet despite all the odds, he had moved with the speed and courage of someone much older. The guests watched in a mixture of awe and confusion. Where had this child come from? Who was he? No one knew. No one had seen him before, and certainly no one had expected him to be the one to save the bride. Isabel, still trembling from the shock, looked down at the boy. She had never seen anyone so small yet so determined. His wide eyes met hers, and for a moment there was a strange connection between them. The boy's gaze wasn't filled with pride or excitement, but instead, it was full of uncertainty, as if he wasn't sure what to do next. Isabel could feel his discomfort, and despite the circumstances, she couldn't help but feel a wave of empathy for him. Brandon slowly stood up, still holding Isabel's hand, and turned to face the crowd. His voice, though filled with gratitude, held a note of confusion. "Who is he?" he asked, his eyes scanning the guests. "Does anyone know who this boy is?" But no one responded. Some whispered to one another, speculating about the boy's identity, while others simply stared in disbelief. He had appeared out of nowhere, just in time to save Isabel from a horrible fall. Someone from the crowd stepped forward, holding out a bottle of water. Another guest, dressed in a sharp suit, offered a $100 bill. "Here, son," the man said, his voice eager. "Take this, you deserve it." But the boy didn't move. He simply stood there, still holding Isabel's wrist, his expression unchanged. He didn't take the money. He didn't accept the water. Instead, he just looked at the bride, his gaze softening. A faint smile crossed his face, but it wasn't the smile of a child who had just done something heroic. It was the smile of someone who knew deep down That he hadn't done it for recognition or reward. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. Isabel, still in shock but with her calm demeanor returning, knelt down beside the boy. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "You saved my life." The boy didn't respond, his gaze still fixed on her. It was as if he had no words to offer, or maybe he simply didn't know what to say. Instead, he just smiled again, though his eyes seemed distant, as if he was thinking about something far beyond this moment. Brandon looked at the boy, then back at Isabel. "You saved her life," he repeated softly, his voice filled with awe. "Thank you, son." The boy still didn't speak. Instead, he glanced around at the crowd, his expression unreadable. "Where are your parents?" Isabel asked, concern in her voice. "Where did you come from?" The boy hesitated, his eyes flickering to the ground. It was clear that the question made him uncomfortable. His small hands clenched into fists at his sides, as though he were gathering the strength to speak. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "I don't have any parents," he said, his words heavy with an unspoken sadness. The crowd fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Isabel and Brandon exchanged a glance, both struck by the boy's honesty and the quiet pain in his voice. "Is there someone who takes care of you?" Brandon asked gently. The boy shook his head, his eyes cast downward. "I've been on my own," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to be alone anymore. I saw the food and the lights and I thought maybe someone would help." The silence that followed was thick with emotion. Isabel's heart ached for the boy. He had saved her life, yet here he was, alone, without a family, and without anyone to care for him. The reality of his situation hit her hard. How could anyone, especially a child, be left to fend for themselves? It was a thought that filled her with both anger and sorrow. Brandon, too, was deeply moved. He couldn't stand the thought of this young boy being alone, struggling to survive without anyone to turn to. Without thinking, he bent down and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You're not alone anymore," he said softly. "We'll help you. We'll find a way to help you." The boy looked up at Brandon, his wide eyes filled with something Brandon couldn't quite read. Was it hope? Relief? Fear? It was hard to say, but in that moment, Brandon made a promise to himself. He would not let this boy go back to the life he had been living. Just then, a voice from the crowd interrupted. "Maybe he's part of the staff," someone suggested, trying to make sense of the boy's presence. But no one was sure. Security guards moved toward the boy, but Isabel immediately stepped in. "No," she said firmly. "He's with me. Please, don't touch him." The boy's eyes darted nervously between the crowd and the couple, unsure of what to expect. But Isabel's words seemed to offer him some reassurance. She placed a hand on his shoulder and smiled at him warmly. "You're safe here," she said softly. Brandon and Isabel exchanged a look, both of them now deeply invested in this boy's fate. This young, brave hero had entered their lives at the most unexpected moment, and somehow, he had already begun to change everything. And in the silence that followed, the promise of something new, something bigger than the wedding itself, began to take root. The guests continued to whisper among themselves, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. No one had ever seen anything like it. A small boy, no older than 7, rushing forward to save the bride's life in such an unexpected, heroic act. Yet, there he was, standing in the middle of a grand wedding, his clothes tattered, his feet bare, and his face a mix of uncertainty and quiet strength. Isabel, still shaking from the shock, had kneeled down beside the boy. Her heart ached for him. She could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of something far beyond his years. Her mind raced as she wondered what had led this boy to be standing here today, saving her life. She could feel his uncertainty, his hesitation, but also a quiet sense of resilience. This wasn't just a random child. It was someone who had experienced far more than any child should. Brandon, too, was deeply moved. The boy had saved Isabel without hesitation, without asking for anything in return. Yet now, standing in front of him, Brandon couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. What would happen to this child? What was his story? The boy had acted as though it were the most natural thing in the world to throw himself into danger, to help someone he didn't know, but there was so much more to him than just that moment. There was pain. There was loss. And there was a need for something much deeper than just a fleeting thank you. "You're a hero," Brandon said gently, placing his hand on the boy's shoulder. "You saved my fiancé's life. We owe you more than we can say." The boy didn't respond. He just looked up at Brandon with wide eyes, as if unsure how to process the gratitude being offered to him. Isabel, still kneeling beside the boy, reached out to him once more. "What's your name, sweetheart?" she asked softly, her voice full of warmth. The boy hesitated, his eyes flicking between Brandon and Isabel. His small hands fidgeted nervously, and he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. It was clear that he wasn't used to being the center of attention. He wasn't used to receiving kindness, much less praise. "Micah," the boy finally whispered, his voice small but clear. "My name's Micah." "Micah," Isabel repeated, her heart swelling. "It's a beautiful name." She smiled gently at him, her eyes filled with compassion. "Where are your parents, Micah? Do you have anyone looking after you?" The boy's expression faltered for a moment. His eyes dropped to the ground and a heaviness seemed to settle over him. For a brief moment, Isabel thought he might not answer. But then, in a quiet voice, he spoke. "They're gone," Micah said softly. His voice cracked slightly and Isabel could feel the raw pain in his words. Brandon's heart sank. "Gone?" he repeated gently. "What do you mean?" Micah's small hands clenched at his sides as he tried to hold back tears. "My mom..." Micah's voice trailed off and he looked up at the sky for a moment as if trying to hold back the flood of emotions, threatening to overwhelm him. She's gone. She didn't wake up after the fire. The fireman told me she wouldn't come back. She told me to hide." Isabel's breath caught in her throat as the full weight of Micah's words hit her. She could barely comprehend the depth of the pain this little boy had endured. "How long has this been?" Brandon asked, his voice tight with emotion. 3 weeks, Micah replied quietly, his voice barely audible. "I've been hiding behind a building. I've been waiting for her to come back." His words hung in the air, like a heavy weight. The crowd was silent, the air thick with sorrow. Isabel's heart shattered for him. A 6-year-old, left to fend for himself, with no one to care for him, no one to love him. The thought was unbearable. "I didn't know where else to go," Micah continued, his voice cracking. "I saw the wedding and thought, maybe someone would help. I didn't mean to ruin anything." Isabel reached out and placed a hand gently on his small arm. "You didn't ruin anything, Micah," she said softly, her voice full of empathy. "You saved my life. You're a hero." The guests around them were visibly moved. Some were wiping away tears, others whispered among themselves, touched by the boy's bravery and the heartbreaking story he had just shared. Brandon's throat tightened as he looked down at Micah, his heart breaking for the little boy who had been through so much. "Micah," Brandon said quietly, his voice filled with emotion, "I can't bring your mom back, but if you'll let us, we'd like to help. We'll make sure you're not alone anymore." Micah looked up at Brandon, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "Help me?" he asked, his voice tinged with doubt. "Is there someone who can help you?" Isabel asked gently. Micah shook his head slowly. "No one," he whispered. Brandon took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. "Then we'll help you. You won't be alone anymore. We'll find you a home, a family." Micah's eyes widened, a mix of disbelief and hope flickering in his gaze. He looked from Brandon to Isabel as if trying to understand what they were offering. "You'll be safe with us," Isabel said softly, her eyes filled with warmth. "We'll take care of you." The words hung in the air for a moment, the crowd silent as they processed what had just been offered. Micah's expression softened, and for the first time he seemed to relax. A small, tentative smile appeared on his face, as if he were beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had found the family he had been searching for. As Isabel and Brandon looked at each other, they both knew that this was only the beginning. Their lives and Micah's would never be the same. And as they made the promise to help him, they realized that sometimes the greatest gift of all is not the wealth or status that comes with a grand wedding, but the simple act of offering love and support to someone who truly needs it. The days that followed the wedding were a blur of emotions, paperwork, and quiet moments of reflection. The once grand wedding, which had begun as a symbol of wealth and extravagance, now held a different kind of meaning. Brandon and Isabel had found a new purpose, a mission they had never expected, caring for Micah. Their love story had taken a turn, and though it was far from the life they had envisioned for themselves, it was a life they both embraced wholeheartedly. Brandon, with all his resources and connections, wasted no time in making sure that Micah would never have to face another day alone. Together with Isabel, they contacted local authorities, lawyers, and social services, all in an attempt to track down Micah's past and ensure his future. It wasn't easy. It wasn't quick. But they were determined. They soon discovered that Micah's mother, Melissa Adabio, had worked as a waitress and a night cleaner to support her son. She had been a woman of great strength, working long hours to make ends meet. But that strength had been extinguished too soon when she died in a hit-and-run accident. No one had claimed her body. No family had come forward, and Micah had been left to survive on his own for weeks. The realization struck Brandon and Isabel deeply. How could a child be left to fend for himself like that? It was heartbreaking, and it stirred something fierce within them. They knew they had to act, not just for Micah but for others like him, whose lives had been shaped by hardship and neglect. Isabel, who had always been passionate about helping others, was the driving force behind the search for Micah's family. Though the story had begun with a wedding, it had transformed into something much greater. This was no longer about a lavish celebration or high society. This was about saving a young boy who had been forgotten by the world. As the weeks passed, Micah's life began to change. He had a home, he had people who cared about him, and for the first time in his life, he had a sense of security. Brandon and Isabel made sure to give him the love and support he needed, and they took every opportunity to make him feel safe. Micah had spent so much time hiding, both physically and emotionally, that it took time for him to fully open up. But little by little, the walls he had built around himself began to crumble. Brandon, though always a busy man with his business empire, took time out of his day to spend with Micah. He would take him to the park, teach him how to ride a bike, and on quiet evenings sit with him and read stories. Isabel, with her gentle heart, became Micah's guiding light. She helped him with his homework, played games with him, and always made sure he knew he was loved. Their home, once a place of luxury and solitude, now hummed with the laughter and chaos of a child's presence. It was a change neither of them had anticipated, but a change they welcomed with open arms. But there was still more to be done. Micah's mother had left behind a modest grave, one that had been largely forgotten. Brandon and Isabel, moved by the woman's sacrifice and the bond between mother and child, decided to visit the cemetery one quiet Saturday. They took Micah with them, and as they stood before the grave that read, Melissa Adabio, beloved, mother always brave, Micah placed the red string from his wrist on the stone. It was a simple gesture, but one that carried so much weight. I kept it for you, Micah whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Isabel knelt beside him, her hand resting on his back. She would be so proud of you, baby, she said softly, her own eyes misting over. It was a moment of deep sorrow, but also one of healing. For Micah, placing the string on his mother's grave was his way of saying goodbye, of finally letting go of the pain that had held him captive for so long. For Brandon and Isabel, it was a chance to honor the woman who had given so much for her son, even in the face of unimaginable hardship. A few weeks later, Brandon and Isabel decided to renew their vows. The grand wedding they had originally planned had been put on hold, But now, with Micah in their lives, they knew they needed to mark the moment. But this time, it wasn't about fancy gowns or expensive venues. It was about family, love, and the promise they had made to each other. And to Micah. The vow renewal took place in their backyard under a string of fairy lights. There were no photographers, no drones hovering above them, just the soft glow of the lights and the warmth of their love. Micah stood between them as the ring bearer, his little hands clutching the small pillow that held the rings. When the ceremony was over and the photographer snapped the last shot, Isabel pulled Micah close. "I love you, Mom," Micah whispered, his voice small but full of sincerity. "I love you, Dad," he added, and Brandon bent down, placing a soft kiss on his forehead. For the first time, Micah felt the love and security that every child deserved. He had a family, a real family, and he wasn't alone anymore. Years later, people still talked about the wedding that had taken place on the bridge, but not for the reasons they had originally thought. It wasn't the wealth, the beauty, or the luxury that made it memorable. It was the story of a little boy, barefoot and broken, who saved a bride's life and, in the process, found the family he had always longed for. Brandon and Isabel's life had changed forever. They had not only gained a son, but they had learned that sometimes the greatest gift of all isn't found in the things you can buy or the places you can go. It's found in the people you choose to love. And for Brandon, Isabel, and Micah, that gift was everything.